Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you. I want to talk a little bit about the future professions. The goal of my presentation isn't to kind of have you panicking and streaming and running out of the room at the end of my presentation, but at the very least I want you to be leaning in a little bit to think about some of the emerging trends and opportunities, but also challenges that we face. Part of my work is studying innovation and looking at how organizations change and they grow. And for the most case, we're pretty excited about innovation because it helps our organizations thrive and survive in difficult times. But we also see a different type of innovation sometimes called disruptive innovations. So think of your smartphone. I mean, it's been 10 years since the invention of smartphones, but they fundamentally changed our lives. We have computers in our pockets. So a pretty powerful innovation. But there's also disruptive innovations that aren't as positive, particularly for the powerful incumbents that are in those positions. Take the media industry, for example. A decade ago, or not much longer, it was one of the most powerful, most profitable, most dominant industries anywhere in the world. And right now, most media companies are barely struggling to survive. So the question I want you to explore a little bit today is, what's the future of professions, the agrologists in particular, if you will, in a disruptive world? So I want to just kind of walk through some elements, and sometimes it's useful to just take a quick step back and think about what that means. So not too far ago, like literally 300 years ago, we lived in a world which was a feudal society. And a feudal society, for the lack of better words, was a social contract. I was prepared to exchange my freeholder status to work on a feudal world in an agricultural setting in exchange for security, because we didn't have central governments that could provide a safe state. So I was prepared to live a very isolated world and do that. And it was a useful exchange. But we quickly realized in a feudal environment that we just couldn't be self-sufficient. We had to have some level of trade and some level of external services provided. So along emerged towns that were opportunities for people to basically create industries, to provide supplies that the feudal farms couldn't provide. And the providers of those things were artisans. The artisans were things like candlestick makers, bakers, sewers to do clothing, and some very, very basic things. But the artisans were the precursors of what you are today as a profession. And they did a number of things really, really well. One is they dealt with the body of knowledge and provided the training. The artisan was the ability to create the master and the apprenticeship model that you're all living examples of. They also prevented access. So we talked about whether it's a good thing to prevent access or not, but they certainly made it difficult. If you weren't part of the guild, you couldn't come into the town and start to open your candlestick making your business. But they also set rates, and the rates were allowing so people could earn a viable living. All things that professionals do right now because they held an exclusive power over a particular body of knowledge or a skill set. Now the Industrial Revolution came along, and if you look the Industrial Revolution, one of the things its purpose was actually to break the guilds, because they didn't want that power of control being held by a small select group of people. So industrialization provided that opportunity. But more to the point, industrialization also created the demand for more knowledge. And so if you look at the last century or so, it's been the century of professions. Professions who had exclusive bodies of knowledge and that were necessary to apply to do a particular part of work. And that the value of that was not only useful for society because you provided a valuable contribution, but it's most particularly useful for you as professionals. Professionals in our society are the most influential. They're often the most well-off, and they have high levels of education and expertise, and therefore respect and prestige. And so in a world where expertise was in limited supply, we turned and looked at professionals as a provider for doing that. And we've all been pretty useful beneficiaries of that work. The challenging situation now is that at a pinnacle? If you think about the concept of an S-curve, where industries, businesses follow an S-curve, when you get near the top of the S-curve, it's hard to determine whether the curve is going to go up in a continuous basis, whether it's going to level off, or whether it's going to go into decline. So let's play this out a little bit. If you think about your work, there's a kind of a simple economics of the knowledge that you have. The first three move you from a craft, where there's not a defined body of knowledge, but there's some smart people. Then you move to a level of standardization, and then you systematize. All that's done within the professional group. So all of the work you're doing right now to build competencies, to determine levels of standards of requirements for certain skill sets are part of that work. What happens when that moves externally? What happens when other people or other groups are able to start to provide that to other sources? Well, there's some business models that you can provide, but they look a lot different than the typical, fee-for-service approach, the engagement that you as professionals often provide. Is there a risk to that? And so let's play this out. You as professions, if you will, have three kind of core elements that are really essential to your work. You have a body of knowledge. And you work hard to build that body of knowledge, to transfer it to new members, to keep it up to date. You are able to apply that knowledge to solve complex social problems, but you also are dependent and sanctioned on government to provide that, if you will, seal of approval, but also ability to regulate yourselves and ability to limit access or control access into that world. I would argue each of those things is under some interesting challenges right now. So let's take the body of knowledge. Do you have the same level of exclusivity that you once does? Well, why don't you Google that? Think about that from an interesting piece. The knowledge that we thought was unique to ourselves now is much more in the public domain. Take that further and look at other professions, and some of the biggest problems in the medical profession is people in fact do Google their illnesses before they go to the doctor and say, no, I don't think it's that. I'm much more looking at it's a melanoma. In fact, they're providing self-diagnosis. It's creating interesting chaos in the profession, but you have people accessing knowledge, sometimes dangerously. But it's a different world if you're a profession now than it used to be. So look at some of those questions. Is our knowledge still unique? Is it moving towards a commodification where it's more generally available? We now know that, think about the accounting world. Intuit, online tax accounting has dramatically changed the typical tax profession because few of us could understand that world before. Now we go online and complete our taxes in 15 minutes on a free online website. What's that doing to the accounting profession? Is it protected? And you go through those questions. So the interesting challenge at the same time that you're pressured and your association is working hard at building its body of knowledge, I would argue that in some ways it's never been more fragile. It's never been more transitory. It's never been more available for other people to access. And remember, I'm not talking about that as being necessarily a good thing. Sometimes your worst problem is when someone is able to access knowledge that requires also the understanding of the application to use it well, and therefore they become quite dangerous. But that doesn't diminish the fact that the body of knowledge that we once held to be unique for ourselves may be much less so than we thought. The second thing is the ability to provide, the solution to a problem that's valued by society. And the interesting question is, are we able still to demonstrate that value? Are other people able to provide that value? Is technology able to provide that value? And when you look at the emergence of technology in particular, there's a strong tendency in professions to say, oh yes, technology is going to affect all the other professions, the accountants, the lawyers, the doctors, the nurses, but no, I think we're kind of excluded from that, we're protected. Check yourselves again on that one, because technology is dramatically going to affect all of us in ways that we can't predict. And sometimes that's going to be positive, sometimes it's going to be quite disruptive, going back to our original theme. So the questions, how is our value demonstrated still through the knowledge we applied? And the interesting question that you also have to have is, value is defined not only by what you provide, but how the customers perceive that. Is the value provided by the customer, or perceived by the customer, still the same? And what does that look like in relation to our pricing models, in relation to our ability to provide services where we use juniors rather than the senior people? What does that do for the classic engagement, classic fee-for-service models, et cetera, et cetera? So it has ripple effects all through what we do to ensure that we're able to say with confidence that we're still providing value to customers. And remember, sometimes we talk to ourselves and we spend a lot of time convincing ourselves that we're adding value. we should probably ask customers about that a little bit more at times too. The final piece is this whole role of sanction by government. And for me, it's an interesting piece because the government plays multiple roles in your life. First of all, they create the regulations that allow you to exist. That's wonderful, but right now government's also grappling with the fact that there's a whole number of professional bodies out there. Are there too many? Do we have to deal with some consolidations? Is it appropriate that we delegate authorities to different things? We're seeing the rise of paraprofessionals and different groups that are trying to convince government and others that they should be allowed to do some of the same things that you do. If you're not seeing it in your profession, look at the nursing world. Right now, we not only have registered nurses, we have licensed professional nurses, we have practical nurses, it goes on and on. Every one of them can use the term nurse as part of their title. It's causing chaos within the healthcare system trying to sort that out, but quite clearly there are large organizations making decided choices to move away from the number of registered nurses they're using to the number of LPNs you're using from a cost perspective alone. What does that do for you as a profession if there's others that are stepping up and saying, we can do that too, and we can do that a lot cheaper? Secondly, government uses you as an employer, and you get into the classic challenges of what's your role as a professional versus your role as an employer or as an employee to a government if you're told to do certain things. And we see that right now in the whole tension that we're seeing with the role of science, particularly in the United States, but we saw it in the federal government as well. Where do we stand on that? What's our role? What's our autonomy? What's our level of freedom? Governments purchase your services. Government delegates the role of auditing and compliance to you. So there's multiple roles of government. Don't assume for a minute that what exists now is going to exist moving into the forward. And I don't want to be a dooms person here, but governments will not necessarily act in consistent ways moving forward. And we're seeing that right now in other professions much more actively than in ours. So if you think about future scenarios for your world, I would argue that what you're experiencing now is very unlikely to be the case what you're experiencing in 10 years from now. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what that's going to be because we just don't know. At the very least, if you're not on the cutting edge of technology in your practice right now, you're in deep trouble. Because the technology shifts that we're seeing in all the professions are dramatically changing the world literally as we speak. So I would suggest that your professional relevance is going to be deeply tied to technology. But you could also see far fewer practitioners, because one of the things with technology is if I can build an online tool for software for accounting, I remove the need to have a lot of accountants. I get some accountants who make a ton of money because they developed the software tool, but the thousands of people that used to do my paperwork and auditing aren't necessary anymore. So do you see far fewer professionals using technology to leverage their world, but then how many of you in this room aren't relevant anymore? So again, take that as just a consideration. Do you see a consolidation where we're now starting to say, you know what, we don't need as many different professionals? Do you in fact take that consolidation to a place where government is saying, well, rather than hire a profession to do that on our behalf, maybe we'll do it ourselves? And what does that mean for the profession? And finally, you could see a huge amount of fragmentation going actually the other way, which you're seeing probably more likely in healthcare right now, is rather than nurses and doctors, we're seeing a whole array of multiple types of people playing different roles, and ideally that works in a kind of a team environment. We're still seeing that as a work in progress, obviously. So the final thing I want to leave you with is that, again, the green box in the middle, how do we provide social value, is the critical one. But you cannot ignore the fact of our body of knowledge and also the role of government in being able to influence both of those things. I think the final slides I would think is that, and this has come up already a couple of times, it's just not enough anymore to be really good at your job and to be able to create a case that you are. We have to be better at telling our story. And that story is not a bunch of nicely packaged advertisements we put on TV. If you watch any of the patterns anymore, no one watches TV, so don't waste your money there. The stories we need to tell need to be virtual, they need to be continuous, they need to be on social media, they need to be not just from the association, they need to be from all of us, because we need to be able to communicate our value in this competing world where a lot of other people are saying, why would we continue to support these people or pay for these people or regulate these people because we're not sure of the value that they have. The final slide, though, I want to just leave you as a bit of caution, is that when you have disruptive innovation, the people who were in the existing role of power the incumbents nearly always lose. Kodak is the classic example. Most profitable company that ever existed, attracted the brightest and the best for almost 100 years. 25 years after they did the research on digital cameras, they're out of business. They're bankrupt. From the top of the peak to being completely eliminated because they couldn't respond to the digital photography world. And it's not because they didn't know what was happening, but they were making so much money on film that they couldn't step back and say, well, could we go on this other way? So disruption has multiple different pieces. It's not because people are stupid or not seeing these patterns. It's because their inherent systems make it difficult for them to respond to that. So one of the things I want you to do is be very careful about, oh yes, it's happening everywhere else, it's not happening to us. But also be very willing to question the core ways that you do your work, because in fact change will occur and you're going to have to be able to respond to that.